Welcome to Diary of a Sheep Dairy Farmer, where we talk all things dairy sheep, from breeding to lambing to milking and everything in between the outside. I'm your host, Becca, owner, operator, and glorified farmhand of Hidden Hollow Sheep Dairy. Welcome back, guys, to another day of dairy sheep. I hope all my American family and friends had a wonderful, safe, and happy 4th of July. I was going to have this episode out last week, but between haying, irrigation, and the holiday and life, it just did not happen. We are in full hay season over here, and I was originally going to have my husband on to talk about hay for dairy sheep, but the man is a bit busy between still stacking hay for a few old customers, dealing with his full-time job, helping me out with a few things on the farm, and trying to keep up with all the functions he is expected to do as commissioner-elect. The parades alone have kept us busy this last month, and we had a 4th of July parade last week and another small town one this coming weekend. So I will catch him when I can. I decided today I was going to talk about some of the more controversial things that I do on my sheep farm that I always have people complain about when I post about them. I picked like my top, I want to say there were 4 or 5. Of course, now that I've written it all out, I cannot remember. So I always get people that complain that I'm doing it wrong, and the experts, quote unquote, they all do it this way or that way. So I figured I would go over today some of the controversial things that I do that work for me. They may not work for everybody, but over the last 10 years, this has been what we have incorporated onto our farm that has, I don't want to say made life easier for us, better for us, but has contributed to making things a little simpler for us, if that makes sense. So first, I'm going to start out with what I get the most complaints about that we have been doing basically since we started lambing in our barn. Our barn is an old riding arena. Our farm was a horse farm for years and years and years and years. My father-in-law was a horse trainer. He trained rodeo queens. He trained barrel racers. He trained ropers and all sorts of stuff. And so we have an amazing barn that was literally sitting and rotting away, and I turned it into my lambing barn. We're still not 100% sure if my father-in-law would be proud, because when he was a child, he was a sheep farmer, or if he would be rolling in his grave knowing what we have done to his horse barn. So, all that being said, the number one thing is little to no straw usage. I have never been a big fan of straw. I don't know what it is about straw that makes me dislike it, but I just find it dirty and annoying and a pain. We really use very little straw on our farm. We always have. The most we use it is in the winter in the outside pens for the rams and any other sheep we may have in them. Especially where, like, when the snow starts to melt, or if it rains really heavy and it puddles, we straw very heavily in those standing water areas. But we do not do a whole lot of strawing, even in our outside pens, if we don't have to. Now, I do use straw in the jugs when lambing, mainly just to soak up some of the blood and afterbirth as needed from the ewes, and basically to give a softer place for the lambs to lay. The area where our jugs are located is probably the hardest ground in the barn, so it is not the fluffy dirt that the rest of the barn has. The last few years, I have really bent to pure pressure, which is kind of surprising because I have never been a pure pressure type of person. And I strawed very, very heavily in what I call my nursery, which is where the ewes and the lambs go after their 3 days of bonding in the jugs. In about, was probably 2019, 2020, um, we ended up with coccidiosis. It was brought into our barn by a renter, and I always blamed it on the excess straw that they used for bedding and the grass that they fed their lambs. We had lambed in that barn for 2 years with no issue. Now, full disclosure, it is an old horse barn. And as our old vet said, it could have been living in the dirt for decades, and it was just brought to the surface due to the heat of the extra straw and grass. So I am still blaming it on the straw. All that being said, I don't straw the maternity pen, which is where my ewes lamb. This was on the advice of that same vet years ago when we started out. He was big on the all natural, which I'm really not, but I took his words to heart. And he loved when we were lambing on pasture. Not so happy when we switched to the barn, but told us under no circumstances should we ever lamb on straw or shavings or any other kind of bedding. It would only result in problems. And we really took that to heart. And while I may get blasted every lambing for lambing on dirt, in the 8 years we have lambed in that barn, I have not had very many lambing issues. I've never had to dip navels. I have a very incredibly low mortality rate. In my last, so even just this year's lambing, I had my winter and spring lambing. I had, 190 lambs total were born. Of those 190 lambs, I only had 6 stillborns, and I did not have a single case of joint ill, and I didn't write down the mortality of any of the, I think I only had, this is the problem with having a bad memory. I didn't write it down, but I think I only had eight lambs. We'll go high. We'll say 10 lambs total of those 190 that died before the 30-day mark. So I don't feel like that I have had super major problems. And usually any of those problems have come after I have moved them into the nursery where there is straw. So all that being said, this year, due to the straw shortage in our area, apparently there's no market for barley. So everyone is growing corn, which means no straw. I will be lucky if I can find enough for my jugs for all 3 lambing groups. And that means there will be little to no straw, if anything, even in my nursery. Maybe I'll get lucky and get my hands on some pea straw for the winter to use for the sheep, but I know the cattle guys usually buy that stuff up pretty quick. So, controversial number 2, no creep. Again, I get people all the time, oh, you need to be feeding those lambs creep. Feed those lambs creep. Feed them creep. No. I used to feed creep to my lambs. I got sucked into the whole mindset that if they aren't gaining X amount of weight per day, they aren't eating enough, they aren't gaining fast enough. Then I wised up and remembered I am not raising meat sheep. I'm raising dairy sheep. Do I want the boys to grow quickly for sale? Yes. But I also want them to do so naturally, without a ton of fillers. And I find with most creep feed, most of them just have a lot of molasses with a little bit of grain. If I could find a really good creep feed that didn't have a ton of molasses in it, I might consider creep again. But I had a really bad experience feeding creep to a group of lambs. I think I talked about this I think it was my weaning episode, where I weaned the lambs early due to the bald eagles attacking and killing my lambs. And then I fed them creep with their hay, and I had a number of them bloat and die. It was not pretty, and I decided then that creep was a joke, at least the store-bought stuff, and I would not feed my sheep creep again. Then a friend suggested I try what he was using, which was a specialty mix that he was a nutritionist and he had put together for his lambs, and it cost a pretty penny. And I can say with all honesty, I didn't see really any difference in my lambs after they had been on it for a month. Now, they didn't bloat on it, so I will say that was a plus, but I didn't see a difference between the ones that had been on the creep for a month compared to the ones that had just been on good pasture. So now we just stick to weaning at 3 months if and when we can, keeping the lambs on as much hay as they can possibly eat if they're in a dry pen or if they are out to pasture, to make sure they are on the best pasture, just like the ewes. So far, it is working for us. When we weaned our February and March lambs, the smallest were about 50 pounds, which would have been my Icelandic Finn crosses, and they always seem to be on the smaller side because they are a heritage breed sheep, which are a smaller sheep, and up to 85 pounds on the bigger side, which are my Lucane and East Frisian lambs. So, number 3, no rotational grazing. This may not be so controversial, but people always seem a little bit surprised when I tell them we don't rotational graze the 80 or so acres that the sheep live on 90% of the time of the year. We let them free range that area. It has a lot of wooded area, and it's kind of cut up helter-skelter around the hayfields and some marshy type land where the lake leaks. The majority of it stays green pretty much all year due to underground springs, so we don't need to worry about irrigating it, but there are some spots that dry up pretty quickly. It is on the list of things to do to make it a little more manageable to graze sheep, to kind of fence things off so that I can sort of push them in a circular pattern, so to speak, so that I can like close gates behind them and keep them in this one area, but more so that they can't backtrack into something they've already eaten, but they can still go forward and keep eating more. I don't know that that's technically a rotational grazing. I think it's more of just keeping them out of what they've already eaten, more than keeping them in one area for a certain amount of time and then moving them to the next area. It's more of just keep moving them forward. Maybe it is. I don't know. Anyway, eventually we'll get all our fencing done and we'll be able to move the sheep a little bit better. But we only have so much time to get so much done during the summer. It would be nice to rotational graze some areas where we can't get water and that the grass dies off by June. There's a couple areas on the farm that are dried out and dead right now and going to seed that the sheep just won't touch. But in May, they were green as could be and would have been perfect for the sheep had I had enough sheep back there to graze it down before it turned brown. Oh well, there's always next year. But even those spots are few and far between. Maybe 2, if I am totally honest, that I would section off so that the sheep could graze them first before they go to seed and then are of no use anymore. And then it would literally be a 1 or 2 time feeding. So I guess not really a true rotational grazing situation on that either. More of an eat them down to dirt, so less of a fire hazard situation. So number 4, I keep singles. This one always seems to get people. You'll hear a lot of times, don't keep singles. They only ever have singles. Maybe on average, over the course of their life, they have more singles than twins. But it's rare for me to keep a single that will only ever have singles. And even if she does only ever have singles in her life, it's usually a pretty big one that's easy to sell come weaning, especially if it's a boy. I have never really understood people's fear of singles. When I started out and was growing my flock, I kept everything. The good ones, the bad ones, the single ones. Over the course of 10 years, I have plenty of records to go back on and look over my singletons to see how they have done. We're talking probably around 600 head of sheep that have come and gone through the farm over those years. And of those years, I have had 11 that were singles that only ever gave me nothing but singles. Those are not good enough odds for me never to keep a single. My husband likes the big singleton boys, not to keep as rams, but to weather and to sell. They usually bring top money because they grow fast with no competition, and we can sell right off at weaning with no extra feed going into the lambs. So, not the last thing we do, but last on our list for today is baling hay dry. I posted a recent video of us baling our first cutting hay, and the first comment I got was, "Nice looking hay, but you're baling it too dry." Yep, that's the point. We purposely bale our hay dry in the heat of the day with no moisture. We have done it this way since we got into sheep, and people think we're nuts. But there is a method to our madness. Normally, when you cut apart a small bale of hay, it falls apart in nice, manageable, throwable flakes. And these flakes are made by the baler's rotation and the moisture in the hay. We take out the moisture in the hay and eliminate the flakes. We want our hay to fall apart when we feed, because 90% of our feeding is done in a bunk of some sort. And my sheep don't have a way to paw at the hay to break those flakes apart. This way I can chop my hay, so to speak, without actually chopping it. Now I do have a hay chopper that someday I might be able to get up and running again. I have a lot of somedays in my life. But for now, baling up the hay dry to toss into the bunks and let it fall apart as if it were already chopped works pretty well for me. I'm sure if I sit down and brainstorm, I will be able to think up probably half a dozen more things we do on the farm that may seem controversial, strange, or downright out there to most, but work really well for us. What are some things on your farm that you do that people look at you like you have two heads, but make perfect sense for you and your animals and farm thrive from it? Let me know in the comments. As always, I appreciate you all being here and thank you for your support. I would be ever so grateful if you would leave a review or share this podcast with your dairy sheep loving friends. Anything to get the word out. As always, you can follow me on Instagram at Diary of a Dairy Sheep Farmer. And if you want to follow the chaos around the farm, you can find me on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok at Hidden Hollow Sheep Dairy. If there are any topics you are interested in, or if you are interested in being a guest on the podcast, please let me know. You can reach out to me at hiddenhollowidaho@gmail.com. Thanks for being here, guys. We'll talk to you next week.